Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President, International Development Services Group. And on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, GTAC, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. I should point out the views expressed are those of the presenter. Ahmad Shah Mohibi will speak on the will Afghanistan become a terrorist safe haven once again? Ahmad is the founder of Rise to Peace and the former US-Counter-Terrorism Adviser in Afghanistan. He frequently provides news analysis and commentary to multiple media outlets, including the Washington Post, CNN, CBS News. He's currently working, I believe, advising the State Department on the events in Afghanistan that started last year. He's also written a chapter in a book for NATO on Afghanistan and has done multiple consulting and advisory services for organizations like NATO. He holds a master's in international policy and practice from George Washington University and a BA in government and international politics from George Mason University. At Rise to Peace, he conducts research and analyzes policy issues related to terrorism, peace-building efforts, and to inform policy practitioners and analysts and the private sector and non-governmental organizations. We will turn it over to Ahmad in a second. Please put your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. Those of you who are regulars know the drill. We'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have what I hope will be a very interesting and robust question period. So Ahmad, thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blackwell. This is great. Thanks for the warm welcome. You went through my biography. I'm not going to go through it again, but I just want to say that today, for the purpose of this conversation, I want to share more experience-based on the topic of terrorism in Afghanistan, and I will take you back to the 1990s and bring you back to the current moment. I'm really pleased, and thank you all for taking the time to participate in this conversation. We all witnessed what happened August 15, 2021. The US troops exited Afghanistan 2 weeks from that date, which was August 31st, and the Taliban took over Kabul, Afghanistan on August 15th. What it tells us the world, what does this mean to human rights, to the girls, to Afghan community, to the labor force, and to the regional when we look into Taliban back in power. So right now, Afghanistan is vulnerable to extremism with a friendly regime back in power, the Taliban. We look into ISIS-K, ISIS of Khorasan, building its so-called caliphate. They're gaining some territories, villages, and they're not that strong as the Taliban used to be in the past 20 years, but they're hoping to make their way to Central Asia. That's what one of my reports, you could feel free to check it at risetopeace.org. I emphasize more on how ISIS, after their defeat, their physical defeat from Syria and Iraq, met its potential to South Asia. And Afghanistan is the perfect place for it, giving the Taliban back in power and giving that there's an instability, political instability, economic instability, and we look into how that is going to impact the people. So my analysis to this point, from a young age, I started working for the US government. When I was 16 years old, I walked into a base and I started offering my services to support the US government war on terror. And to the present day, I've been always encouraging our policy practitioners, generals, and I mean, both civilian and military personnel on creating policies that could work while enabling local change. When I mean local change, by having good partners, by having good programs that could create jobs, that could create equality, that could combat grievances and social inclusion. These are issues and programs or policies that could help a society transition into democracy and to into stability and prosperity. And Afghanistan lacked that for the past 20 years, though there has been gains, tremendous gains that has happened to this state, but since last year, 1 year Taliban back in power. And we will discuss more on how that is going to be a threat to the US national interest, to our allies, and to the Afghan people. So if I put it this way, the whole Afghanistan political trajectory, the war broke out, I would say 40 years ago, and there was a kingdom. And after that, it has been a cycle of conflict. There was a coup, the president of Afghanistan was killed, the communist regime came, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. I mean, 1979 all the way to 1989, Afghanistan went through a year of basically proxy war, Cold War, West versus East, and the US versus the Soviets. And it was then, at that specific decade, 1979 to 1989, Afghanistan, its territory become a footprint of radicals, jihadi fighters, and extremists from all over the world, mainly the Middle East, by rich donors in the Gulf state. And of course, covert CIA operation and US-funded programs through Pakistan. And it opened a door for these militants or these rebels to help the US government and allies to combat the Soviet Union and defeat them in Afghanistan. Well, that 10 years, every resources spent in Afghanistan, training, brainwashing, and mobilizing a force to combat the Soviets, are today, or the current Taliban leaders and other fighters fighting against the world. So enemy, or could be a friend one day, now they're enemy. So that 10 decades is very important for everyone in this conversation. Whenever you want to know about Afghanistan, go 1979, 1989 is the perfect decade for you to study how extremism started in Afghanistan, why Al Qaeda went to Afghanistan, and then how later on Abu Musab Zarqawi, the founder of ISIS, made it to Afghanistan, and so many others. So it has many factors. First is the geography. I think the geography of Afghanistan is perfectly located in the heart of Asia, and there's a Soviet threat to the West, and decide to say, look, geography-wise, perfect. And this goes back to over a century, and the Tsarist and the British. I mean, I'm not going to go back that far, but it has been always a conflict and a clash of civilization, or would say empires in Afghanistan. So Afghans has paid the price over centuries, but there's a mentality, a stupid mentality about among Afghans. I call it the bravery of stupidity. They believe and they think, these are books about it, they call it the graveyard of empires. I think as the graveyard of Afghans. I think that is something the Afghan youth and the Afghan generation needs to work on, that Afghans are paying the price for stupid bravery. But the whole radicalization and the whole safe haven extremism in Afghanistan is as the result of the Cold War, the proxy war, and the, I would say, mainly the Afghan leaders themselves couldn't be able to compromise a unity government after they defeated the Soviet Unions and the Russians who left Afghanistan. So that 10 years ended up transitioning into a conflict, and that civil war between the Afghan leaders. When I say Afghan leaders, there were 7 big political parties in Afghanistan. These parties were fighting against each other after the Soviets left on 1989 or early 1990s. And over thirst for power, each one of them wanted to rule, but few showed interest in compromise. So there's a political toxicity in Afghanistan among the political leaders. And that has to do with very ethnic-centric policies. That is the biggest threat to Afghanistan, where we see right now among the Taliban as well. So to fast forward, I mean, 1992 to 1996, Afghanistan marks the bloodiest civil war among these political parties, where thousands of Afghans died. Afghanistan was a center of missiles. 7 parties were fighting against each other. Missiles were coming inside the town, and people were, experiencing horrific moments. I remember my mom used to take us to the basement crying, and she was doing what a mom supposed to do to protect her children. So those are my earliest memories of Afghanistan, a battleground for war, a war of leaders over power. And then what happens is, at that specific moment, then there are groups, and then there's radicals like Al Qaeda and ISIS, like Abu Musab Zarqawi. They see a footprint in Afghanistan. They say, look, They are fighting between each other. It's time to just have a footprint. It's time to recruit some of them. It's time to give them some money and say, hey, we're going to support you. Let us implement our policies. That was how exactly happened. Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan since 1980s. But then when the war broke out, for them, it was the perfect time to support the Taliban. So while the 7 parties were fighting against each other, Osama bin Laden fundraised a lot of money, and he brought a lot of money to Afghanistan to support the Taliban. In 1996, nobody knew what the Taliban, this group was. I remember when I was little, young enough or little enough to understand who they are. So they knocked the door, they asked for weapons, and that was like September 1996. So we were in September this month, that was September 6th. So 1996, the Taliban came first to power, and groups like Al Qaeda and donors in the Middle East and the Gulf states, backed by a lot of fundamentalist policies, mainly in Pakistan, brought the group to Afghanistan. And they brought an extreme regime. There has been benefits for countries. They have this benefit for groups, Al Qaeda, terrorist groups like Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda wanted to reach and expand its operation globally, and they saw Afghanistan a great place to plan, coordinate, and recruit and radicalize young adults and children. I remember they had a lot of money that they sent missionaries to villages in Afghanistan to recruit young children aged of 5 and above, and they took them to Pakistan for 6 to a year. Sometimes moms never saw their children because they got radicalized, and then from there they went to fight in Afghanistan. So there is benefits. Always look into what is it at the end of the day for each side of the conflict. For Osama, expansion of Al Qaeda operation across the world. For Taliban to bring an extreme regime in Afghanistan and to be able to fight and to be able to rule. And then Afghans paid the price. 1996 to 2001, Afghanistan became a safe haven for terrorism. And we in the US, the policy in here were too busy in domestics, and we abandoned Afghanistan. And Afghan leaders warned continuously that this could be a threat to the US, and there is terrorism, there is Al Qaeda. But those failures, those mistakes are happening right now. We see Taliban back in power. After 21 years after they were toppled in 2001. And what we see right now, Taliban telling the world that they are changed. They're telling the world they're going to run Afghanistan, and particularly they're telling the US government that we will be your partner counterterrorism. So give me a break. Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in the heart of city, in Sherpur. That area is literally near the house of Taliban leaders. So how you could be able to trust a group that once hosted Al Qaeda and once allowed Osama bin Laden to plan attacks and attack Americans and embassies across the world and reach the Twin Towers and kill over almost 3,000 Americans. So we see right now a return of Taliban, meaning the return of extremism and terrorism. Afghanistan is more friendly and safe for extremists to conduct its operation than it was before. They have the equipment, they have the technology. Technology is the most important one in these days. We could look into Twitter and social media, Taliban advancing their propaganda online. We see ISIS is growing. We see the Pakistani-centric group like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jahishi, and TTP, Tehrik Taliban, and Lashkar-e-Taiba. All of them have growing since then. There is a violation of human rights. We saw in the news how prisoners were being shot on their heads. That is what the reality of Afghanistan. And there are things, there are policies that the world can do to stop another 9/11 style attack or prevent future radicals, young adults or children from being radicalized and being mobilized and sent on operations to target civilians. And I will continue to talk on those, but for the sake of this conversation, I just want to open the conversation. But before I do, I just really believe that it's time for the US government and for the international community to stay engaged in Afghanistan for the sake of their own national interests. Terrorism in Afghanistan is terrorism in the world. We saw it in 1990s, we saw it in early 2001, and we're seeing it today. These terrorist groups, particularly Al Qaeda and ISIS and Taliban, same mentality, same ideology. I mean, of course, there are some different schools of thoughts among who to believe which one is better, but at the end, they go on one route, and that path is enemy of humanity, and they just believe that they have to go back to centuries back, and they have to believe that there should be new technology. They just have to believe that there are things that they should be able to do, not others. So I just believe that we have to be smart, and we have to invest on much better policies that could keep us safe here. Just put it this way, if Taliban have control in Afghanistan, if an Afghan refugee, an Afghan evacuee with fabricated documents happen to be a Taliban fighter, correct? The next thing he's in Washington, D.C., the next thing he's in Germany, what's going to happen? So we have to look into the next attacks. Afghans are being brainwashed, they're being radicalized, media is being censored, and Taliban has shown no interest in working with the world. When I say that, there are actions speaks louder than words. There are stuff that you could say, but the actions could prove another thing. And when February 29th, 2020, when the former Trump administration made a deal with Taliban, the whole fundamental or foundation of the deal was that Taliban will cut ties with Al Qaeda. And in return, the US will exit Afghanistan. So what happened a month ago? Ayman Zawahiri was killed in Kabul, Afghanistan. Taliban had a strong intelligence. They had spies all over Afghan government for the past 20 years. How in the world they would not understand, or they didn't know that Ayman Zawahiri, the leader of Al Qaeda group, the notorious group, has come to Kabul in the safest port of city. So these are actions our diplomats, our generals, and our government, our policy practitioners needs to understand in order to better serve their people, the Afghans and the community, to make this world a safer place. With that being said, I want to stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions, share any experience from personal to professional, and I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. That was for your passionate presentation. I mean, one of the questions that comes to mind now, you can think about it a little bit, but what kind of concrete things do you think that the international community should be doing to try and address some of the concerns that you've raised? I mean, everybody's going to be distracted by pandemics, by Ukraine, by inflation, by economic issues, to name just a few. So what kind of bandwidth do you really think the international community has? So we have a couple of questions here. Please, everybody, the Q&A function in Zoom. The first one is from our colleague Jaideep Sakia. There is a spillover of Al Qaeda from the strongholds inside Afghanistan into the Indian subcontinent in recent months. Do you see ISIS of Pakistan encouraging the Al Qaeda into such an endeavor? Also, do you see a Chinese hand in the subterfuge as well?
Oh, I mean, thank you. That's an excellent question. We look into the ISI, the intelligence of Pakistan. So when we come to countries, each country has its own interest. Pakistan has a long dispute over Kashmir with India, and they see Afghanistan a perfect place to compete their powers. And I believe that everything is possible to happen. But what should happen is a friendlier environment between India, Pakistan, and Kabul and Afghanistan, where they could be able to build a safer South Asia. And I think earlier in that specific question, we see ISIS can find any footprint. I mean, ISIS was founded in Fatah, Waziristan region of Pakistan, by a Pakistani national, Hafiz Saeed, in 2015. And later on came to Afghanistan, and then the mother of all bombs were dropped on them, and then these spread it to the border of Afghanistan with the Central Asian country like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. So there is a region for ISIS that could infiltrate in each side. But when it comes to politics, when it comes to intelligence agencies, of course, they are going to support their people. Of course, they are going to support their own nationalists of their own people. But I think, given what is happening in Afghanistan, the Taliban being silent and the Taliban being willing to help Al Qaeda, there is possibility of threat to India. There's possibility of threat to Tajikistan and Central Asia and to the rest of the world. And I think to your question, Mr. Blackwell, is what concrete things? I think the first one is we have to start the Afghan reconciliation process, meaning that if we truly want to stop this machine of extremism, this Taliban regime that could be able to rule and that could be able to start, deceive the world, we have to bring the Afghan leadership from exile, from different countries, and have an inclusive regime, one that includes the Taliban. I think that is the possible and the most suitable route, because neither the US is interested to spend another $2 trillion to go to Afghanistan and wipe the Taliban, like what they did in back October 7, 2001. And neither the world is interested to send their loved ones to die in Afghanistan. So Afghans are also tired of war. What could happen is negotiations, political settlement. Taliban could work on a unified government, inclusive government, with women included, and that is the best route. Why has been 1 year we have been neglecting and silent on starting the Afghan peace process? I mean, Afghan peace process is the key. And then underneath that, we have other projects and programs that we could be able to work on. For example, we have to say a red and no for human rights violations of Taliban. Creating jobs in Afghanistan. It goes through the worst economic crisis. So if you feed the people, if you give them freedom, and if you give them education, and at the same time have their leaders to come together, work on some unity government, it is a possibility, but it's not easy. It's challengeable. You have to work with Pakistan, you have to work with India, with Russia. China has its own One Belt, One Road initiative, and they have their own economic interest in Afghanistan. So it's kind of Afghanistan war is a war of economics. If you give a piece of pie to each side of the conflict, they may through some sort of compromise. Otherwise, they will continue to fight, and these countries will continue to benefit from the war.
Thank you. We have another question from Ian McKenzie. What are the prospects of the NRF in waging an insurgency against the Taliban? Do they have any local support? Are they hopelessly outclassed and outnumbered by the Taliban?
So they are outnumbered, and they're in Panjshir Valley. Back in 1990s, Ahmad Shah Mohibi, the father of Ahmad Massoud, who is leading the NRF in Afghanistan right now, he was fighting against the Taliban. He was actually the one who warned the world of Taliban and taking over, and the terrorism and the threat of Al Qaeda. So they have capabilities of attacking and ambushing. So that goes back to asymmetric warfare. The irregular warfare is the hardest war that that worked in the favor of Taliban, and it's going to work in the favor of NRF if they continue to get funding from outside. So if you don't get funding, if you don't have bullets to shoot, there is no way for you to continue if you have the hardest or the perfect train or trenches to hit the enemy. Taliban, on the other hand, early 2005, 6, I would say starting 4, did receive tremendous amount of funding, financial resources, and at the same time, they also controlled opium. So they made a lot of money, and they bought a lot of ammunition, and they used the technique what the NRF is using right now to attack the government. So there is potential for them. I think when we come to insurgency, I think that goes back to who is a freedom fighter, who is a terrorist. I think that's something it's defined by individuals and defined by that group, by that ethnic group. What they're fighting right now, is we see in the media, is that the Taliban are killing left and right. They have isolated and they have created a Taliban ethnic-centric policies, and we have been abandoned. And we want to fight for our identity, for our ethnicity. That's what they're claiming, and we want to fight for freedom. So like I said earlier, if Taliban are willing to work with them on a unity government, that is the best solution. Otherwise, today we have NRF. Today we will have a bunch of other militant groups and insurgencies. They will be fighting against the Taliban. There are 17, 18 different ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Each one wants protection. We all heard what happened to World War I, World War II. I mean, that protection is the main cause. You want to protect your identity, your race. You want to protect your children. So that's why political settlement is the key.
There's a supplemental question I'm going to paraphrase here, but you just mentioned this. Are there other emerging guerrilla groups aside from the NRF? And if so, how do you rate their strengths and geographic locations?
Yes, they are. They're not, I would say, a position of gaining territory like villages or districts because they can get it, but they cannot maintain it. That's the hardest part. What the technique, the asymmetric technique in the guerrilla warfare is working perfectly for all of them. So today, during the day, there could be a shopkeeper. During the night, they are an insurgency group, or they are a militant group, a rebel group, a freedom fighter, whatever you want to call it. So we see that increasing. A number of them from that. What's most important is you're being formed by various different ethnic groups. So that means that there is the fight over identity, fight over ethnic. So ethnic cleansing or ethnic tension is key, and that's why a lot of these people are being formed. And so NRF could be the biggest one. But the NRF, they have places in Panjshir, and then there are other militant groups in Andarab, Baghlan province. We see in Badakhshan, and we see in Takhar. So these are places that they have control. And if we look at statistics-wise from last year, they have tremendous progress of at least 85% progress. And we see that doubled and tripled, like I said, if the Taliban continues with their current policy of arresting, shooting, and killing prisoners, and not willing to work with other leaders on some sort of unity government.
And, again, I think all of these questions are following each other naturally. What's the relationship, or how do you see the relationship between the TTP and the Afghan Taliban?
So long answer, it goes back to the ethnicity itself. And there are people who works on creating one Pashtunistan, and kind of like Kurdistan, having one strong that could be able to liberate and separate from Pakistan, and Afghanistan have one big Pashtunistan. That is kind of like what others believe in that capacity. But the looking into the Taliban in Afghanistan and looking to Tehrik-e-Taliban, TTP, they have a lot of similarities in beliefs, similarities in cultural, similarities in social, and similarities in political. So, but when it comes to the Taliban itself, they're more focused right now in Afghanistan to say, hey, we want to build a country here and we want to support us. But I see in the long run, they could be able to have big support, to TTP, and that could jeopardize, and that could be another threat to the Pakistan's national interest. So different groups fighting for different reasons to be able to reclaim. And we look into TTP, one of the biggest reasons they have been founded is because of a lot of harsh policies by the Pakistani government. And I would say they were the same brothers operating on different side of the border for various different reasons. But I could see in the long run, they could be able to form some sort of, like proposal to be a Pashtunistan, but like I say, TTP is mainly in Pakistan, and they're the one fighting against their own government because of so many grievances that they have from the government. High unemployment and no programmings, no jobs, and there's a lot of I would say economic difficulties that these people have in Fatah and Waziristan region of Pakistan. So it could lead into a major issue in the future, which is right now too.
Another question from one of our colleagues in India. Does the Taliban see China as a reliable international partner?
They have seen it the past years. China has been in Afghanistan helping with the copper mining, and China has invested so many resources and projects in Afghanistan. But for the Taliban, when the US said, we're not going to work with you, or in terms of like when the talks were announced dead by former President Trump, Taliban went to China, went to Beijing, and went to Moscow, and then many other countries. The message was that, hey, Americans, you don't want to work with me? I have so many other potential partners in the area. So Taliban are also smart strategically, but China has kind of like the Soviets back in 1980s, I would say 70s and even before, that there's communism expansion policies across the world. China has its own communism through economic investment. The One Belt, One Road initiative, China see the TAPI agreements between Pakistan and Central Asia, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan is the perfect ground for it. They couldn't implement such a big project because they could not control. Safety and security was the biggest reason. But they see Taliban back in power, and if they work with them, it will give billions of dollars to China. And Taliban could get a little bit of that too. So like I said in the beginning, it's a war of economics. Each side is getting a pie. China is not there to just waste their resources. They are there because of their own interest. And Pakistan is their greatest ally, and Taliban could be another one, and that's why they're vouching for the Taliban to be recognized.
Here's another question just related to what you just mentioned about Pakistan. Did Pakistan support the Afghan Taliban when they retook power in Afghanistan?
Yes, they did. Pakistan founded that group. Pakistan trained that group, treated their wounded warriors in the past 20 years, helped them regroup once they were toppled in 2001. And August 15, they helped them to regain power. Put it this way, logically, the international community were in Afghanistan, over 130,000 American troops and 300,000 Afghan troops. And then we look into NATO. So 500,000 troops were in Afghanistan with $2 trillion. Of course, there was a corrupt regime, a failed leadership. But anytime the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, they pushed the Taliban back, they crossed the border. That's facts. There's news. And when I was working in Afghanistan, we detained people that they had identification from Pakistan, and there's all over YouTube and news. And Pakistan also understands that. And they say that, it's hard to control because we have an open border and so many others. Without the help of Pakistan, Taliban would not have taken control of Afghanistan.
This is a more profound question, and I think it's an important one, because if we are going to pivot in Afghanistan to something more positive and constructive, Dr. Chengiz wants to know that, well, his question is, according to the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, the US government did not understand the Afghan context and therefore failed to tailor its efforts accordingly. So what do you think about that, and how should, obviously we can go backwards and relitigate the past, but how should the US now understand this context and reorient its priorities and its efforts?
I think we have to be smart on who we choose and who we select as partners on these countries once we start a war. And at the same time, we have to be smart on how to spend resources on countries without jeopardizing that country's values and traditions while fueling and triggering corruption. There's a lot of lessons learned and failures. But to your question, I think what went wrong was it was on the wake of 9/11 attack. Americans were angry. Everybody was angry that what happened. It was a tragic, barbaric accident that happened. And so the mission was to go kill Osama bin Laden and come back home fast, strike hard, come back. That was the mission. Like the current president and even former presidents, say that we didn't go to Afghanistan to nation build. So if the plan and the policy, and the whole strategy was to just go combat Al Qaeda and terrorism, then that is the challenge and the problem itself. Because fighting is one thing, creating a strategy, a grand strategy that includes democracy, implementation projects, social, economic, good governance, how to build nations, how to learn from failed nation building. I mean, how other governments has failed. That wasn't the purpose. I think that was the struggle that when I was working in Afghanistan, the brave American soldiers, I mean, NATO allies and Afghans, they were fighting a war while the leaders were just confused. I mean, look how many administration we had to this point. President Biden announced withdrawal because he had no other option. They surged the troop, they couldn't win. They reduced the troops, they couldn't win. They spent $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was no win. And I think it goes back to a couple big factors. Number one, there was no policy to nation build. There was policy to counter terrorism, but our policy was lacking sufficient programming technique into it. Killing, arresting, and then detaining was not going to work. Afghan government, we put together a puppet regime that the both presidents, both former Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, handpicked by the American government, ended up betraying the American people. I think that is another big lesson, that we have to be more careful who we have to choose. And then the third, the major one, is corruption. Afghans never, I would say, majority of them saw a dollar bill. You pour dollars on Afghanistan, bags of dollars. These leaders lost the hope of nationalism. So in an army, in a battalion, when you're fighting your enemy, if you didn't have the sense of nationalism, patriotism, what you're fighting for, you have lost the war. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. Look into the Afghan leadership where they're residing today. They're living in castles in Dubai, here in Virginia, California. A former son of Minister of Defense of Afghanistan bought a 20 million house in California. So those are a few examples. I think corruption fit into terrorism, and there was grievances, there's social injustices, and then of course, the lack of Afghanistan leadership. You know, there is, each side has to get the blame for. We picked the wrong people and we lacked the policy, but then there was the Afghan leaders themselves who lied to their people, who betrayed their own people, and they couldn't be able to implement policies that could help Afghanistan. And look what's happening right now. Yes, Afghanistan is a safe haven for terrorism right now, and that is because of the Afghan leaders. There's so much Americans in the world could do. You open your pockets, you give them money. Of course, your mistake is you're not monitoring it. You're not doing a good job auditing it. But then you as an Afghan leader, you have the responsibility to use that resources to save your own people from dying of hunger. So I think mistakes happen on each side. And right now, the biggest is start the Afghan peace process. And we have to have a grand strategy in South Asia, the one that includes India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And we see with the rising tensions in Ukraine, and we see with the whole China and I would say North Korea with the whole nuclear warfare and the threatening messages. I think we need to have I would say, policy, and how to include Afghanistan part of that, and how to benefit the most out of Afghanistan, and how to make sure that we should prevent another style attack, 9/11 style attacks in the future. It all has to do with good policies and good partners, not the one that Taliban are doing right now.
Well, just to add to that question, we have another one that's, you know, what role the neighbors, especially India, can play so that Afghanistan doesn't become another terrorist safe haven.
The role of neighboring countries, a big factor in Afghanistan, particularly India. I think number one is India should stop its clashes in Afghanistan over Kashmir and their own national interest, what's going on between them and Pakistan. And that goes along with the Taliban. Taliban should have a government that is, you know, friendlier towards Delhi, not always towards Islamabad. So it's back and forth. India has interest, and the Taliban needs to respect that interest. And then if there's a unity government, I believe the best policy is for these three countries to be able to have a friendly relationship. We look into the political trajectory of Afghanistan. Mainly Afghan leadership has criticized Pakistan, I mean, excluding Taliban, but they had a friendly relationship towards India, which is not bad. But what I'm saying is it's time for the Afghan leaders to have a smart policy towards Pakistan and towards India. Being nice to Islamabad is not bad, but you have to be nice to Delhi too. I think India could play a big factor in terms of economic development in Afghanistan. They did for the past 20 years, helping, offering scholarships, sending transportation buses. I mean, so many others. We look into helping the Afghan army. But today, India can work with the United States to help our government and allies to support and proceed with the whole Afghan peace talks. If India wants to stay safer, same with Pakistan, same with the neighboring countries, they have to help bring a stable Afghanistan and a stable regime, one that includes the Taliban and other leaders. I think the rule is very big in terms of, because who leads Afghanistan will have a direct impact on Delhi. So for that reason, India cannot be silent. There is terrorism, India will talk about it. There is good governance, India will take pride in it. But India's rule is big, so does Pakistan.
So there's a question here again from one of our listeners, and it's a question that I have as well, which is, we have this conundrum of the Taliban is the de facto government, even though nobody has really accepted or recognized the Taliban as a government. Many countries are still interested in offering humanitarian aid. How can that happen without both inadvertently funneling money to the Taliban or being seen to deal with a government which has not been recognized?
That goes along with the collateral damage when you hit a strike and civilians die. The same thing right now. You cannot allow 25 million people die of hunger just because Taliban are back in power. They are a de facto rule. They're extremists. And I think that is the price of war. That is the price of you have to negotiate. Yes, Taliban are bad, but at the same time, we have a moral obligation to save. We look into the UN report, 18 million children are facing famine. And at the same time, 91%, that is the data, but I would say 95% of Afghans living below $1 a day, below poverty line. So for the US government has been generous in sending millions of dollars to Afghanistan. And we see non-governmental and the European Union has sent a lot of aid to Afghanistan, but it will stay challenging in a way how the aid is not going to the Taliban. I mean, because, yes, these organizations have people on the ground, but at the same time, Taliban, have allowed the aid to come, but they are taking their own portion. I mean, nothing happens for free. And I think that is like I say, the price of war and the price of saving people, it's not easy. Easier solution is to have a unity government that more people could get the aid, and more, 75% of GDP of Afghanistan was from foreign aid. I mean, 1 year, look into it. So there's nothing going on in the country. So Taliban has been, we have the reports that Taliban have used the money that was sent to them to feed their own soldiers. And I think that stays challenge, and I think challenging because there is no way to monitor that aid. Just to listen to the words of Taliban and the project directors or program coordinators on the ground, or country directors.
We have two more questions, and then I think we will wrap it up. The first one is, do you think that ISIS and Al Qaeda have resolved their disagreement about the Shia question?
No, I mean, Al Qaeda is more focused globally, targeting the Western world and targeting their so-called anti-Islamic principles or values. And ISIS-K has been targeting minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and particularly the Shia religious minorities in Afghanistan. So they haven't, and that will continue to increase under the current regime and under the current circumstances.
And I guess the final question, which is perhaps a good place to end, sprinkled through your talk and responses to the questions, you've spoken about this issue of corruption and, corruption of government officials and perhaps, to use your words, bad partners in the past. do you think that we've now just replaced one group of corrupt officials for a new group of thieves or corrupt officials in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, a corrupt regime, a corrupt government, corrupt leadership in so many ways, financially, religiously, politically, delight to the world, and is replaced by a corrupt, radical group that believes in no humanity and human rights, and doesn't believe in progress and democracy, and doesn't believe in women to have the right of education, or the Afghans to have freedom of speech. That is, I think, the hardest part. I think when we look into the founding fathers, we look into the principle of democratic values and what is it to live equally and live freely. We have a moral obligation that there are countries like Afghanistan, and particularly Afghanistan, that there are regimes and groups, as the result of our own actions and policies, are back in power and threatening democracy and being corrupt enough to kill their own people, having them to go to bed hungry at night. I think that is, with that being said, it is the saddest part when we look in Afghanistan. I mean, of course, there has been tremendous gain in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. I don't want to be here just a drowner that everything is so wrong. Of course, 20 years has changed the life of so many people, including mine, that have given me a platform to speak. That so many Afghans around the world now have a voice. There was no voice back then in 1996, 1990s. That is, nobody wants that happen. I think the world needs to wake up that Taliban are lying to you. The only way to have a sustainable democratic government in Afghanistan is to work with them, bring other parties together, and have them to be responsible for their actions. But if you isolate them, isolation brings disaster. And I think Afghanistan never worked good when it's been isolated.
I hope reflect the views of everybody listening to thank you for your informed and passionate presentation. You should be proud of your work. I have watched Rise to Peace grow, so if anybody wants to check out the website, it's risetopeace.com, I believe.
.org.
.org, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
No
I've learned a lot, and I think the listeners have as well, and we're most grateful for your time and patience in presenting and answering so many tricky questions. I'd like to thank everybody who's listening for your participation, and we hope to continue our speaker series in the not too distant future. So Ahmad, thank you very much. We look forward to following your good works in the future. Thank you.
Well,
for
thank you.
us.
This is amazing. The speaker series this is good. This is great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.